Cinderella. Read and listen story by Mumtaz Masood.
Long ago in Persia was a cruel king who married a beautiful lady each day, only to have her imprisoned at dawn the following morning. No one is as beautiful or charming as Shahzad, the minister's daughter. When the king hears of her beauty, he of course wants to marry her. The only way the minister can think of protecting his daughter is to flee with her to another country. But Shahzad tells her father not to worry and allow her to marry the king. Shahzad entertains the king all night by telling him a story which she doesn't quite complete. In this way, she escapes imprisonment because the king wants to hear the end of the tale. The next night, she starts on a new narrative and again leaves it incomplete. She repeatedly does this until the king becomes fond of her and hooked on her stories. Thus, she escapes imprisonment altogether and lives happily ever after as queen. One story amongst the many stories that Shahzad tells the king is that of Cinderella. Cinderella lived with her stepmother, two spoiled stepsisters, and father. Cinderella's mother had died when Cinderella was very young. All Cinderella had left to remind of her mother was a picture of hers that she kept under her pillow to look at every night before going to sleep. At night, the picture seemed to come alive. Cinderella felt the love of her mother surround her and fell asleep dreaming about her. Cinderella's stepmother was very different to the way her real mother had been. She didn't treat Cinderella as well as she did her own daughters. Her father knew about this, but he was too scared to say anything to his wife, because if he did, she threatened to leave him. Shortly after, Cinderella's father passed away too, leaving behind a large sum of money for them all to live comfortably for the rest of their lives. Cinderella kept herself busy doing all the chores in the house, whilst her stepsisters spent their time admiring themselves in the mirror, worrying about their hair and makeup, looking at the latest fashion designs in magazines, and deciding what clothes to buy from the shops next. Despite the fact that Cinderella's sisters had everything that anyone could want, they were never pleased and were always squabbling. They weren't bad looking by face, but their spoiled, selfish behavior made them appear rather ugly. Somewhere far away, a little boy grew into a handsome young prince, and as was the custom, the king was throwing a ball to find a beautiful wife for his son. An invitation was sent to Cinderella's family as well. The two sisters were very excited when they received a letter from the palace. "He's going to choose me as his bride," said one of the sisters with her nose in the air. "Of course he's going to choose me," said the other sister, just as haughtily. The much-awaited day finally arrived. Cinderella's stepsister and mother got ready to go to the ball. They didn't take Cinderella with them, as they were secretly scared that the prince might choose her instead of them. After all, she was rather beautiful by face and good-natured, and so they left her home with a pile of clothes to wash. Cinderella always tried to be very patient and got on with life, but on that day she could not help tears rolling down her eyes. Somehow, as if by magic, her tears turned into stars, and a glittering, sparkling fairy appeared right in front of her, making her jump out of her chair. "Why so sad?" asked a kind, gentle voice, and without giving Cinderella a chance to reply, she added, "You shall go to the ball." "How can I?" sighed Cinderella. "I have no fancy clothes, no fancy shoes, and what's more, a horse and carriage to take me all the way to the faraway place." "Oh, I can sort that out with just a bit of magic," said the fairy, and took out a magic wand. At once, a pumpkin that was waiting to be cooked in the kitchen was turned into a carriage. Cinderella's mice friends were transformed into horses, but for one mouse, who was transformed into a man that would be pulling the carriage. The old dress that Cinderella was wearing suddenly changed into the most beautiful gown that she had ever seen, and her broken slippers into sandals. "Off you go to the ball," the fairy godmother said, smiling. "But I have to warn you that you must leave the ball as soon as the clock strikes midnight, because after that the magic will wear off and everything will turn back to the way it was." Cinderella walked into the ballroom looking absolutely stunning. So stunning that all faces turned around to look at her. "That face looks familiar," thought Cinderella's stepmother and sisters. But they never guessed it was her, because they had always only seen her in cheap, old hand-me-down clothes. Not surprisingly, the prince fell in love with Cinderella at first sight, and had to be reminded to dance with other young ladies too. All too soon, the clock struck 12. Just in time, Cinderella remembered her fairy godmother's warning and rushed out of the ballroom. In her haste, she left one of her sandals behind. The prince tried to catch up with Cinderella, but he lost her in the crowd. All that was left of her was a tiny, beautiful sandal. How tiny is that, the prince thought to himself. Not many young girls' foot would fit into that sandal, but where to begin looking for her? People had come from near and far places, and he hadn't even asked her name. Well, listeners, it was destiny itself which guided the prince to Cinderella's house, but not before the prince and his men knocked on lots of other doors. Many young ladies tried very hard to fit into Cinderella's shoe in order to marry into the royal family, but the sandal was always too small. Finally, the prince and his men knocked at Cinderella's door. The stepsisters and stepmother forbid Cinderella to come in front of the prince. Cinderella had no choice but to listen. Both the stepsisters tried really hard to squeeze their foot into Cinderella's sandal, but of course they couldn't, because the foot was way too large. The prince was about to leave when suddenly a glittering, sparkling light appeared in front of them, followed by Cinderella's godmother. She brought Cinderella out of the kitchen. Despite her cheap clothes, the prince knew that she was his princess. Nevertheless, the godmother used her wand to transform the old dress Cinderella was wearing into a beautiful gown. The prince helped her put on her sandal, which of course fit perfectly. The godmother brought out the other sandal. Realizing that Cinderella was now going to be a princess, her stepmother and sisters started to be very nice to her. They also realized they hadn't been that kind to Cinderella throughout her life and asked for forgiveness. Cinderella forgave them. From that day on, the stepsisters tried to improve their behavior. Their now smiling faces and good nature made them look very attractive. They all lived happily ever after.